What is going on, guys? Vanity here, back with volume 8 of the In the Style of series, this time covering Mind Design sound. Now, Mind Design is one of the most unique artists I've covered in this series, so I'm sure you're all going to be getting a lot out of this tutorial. This is the composition I'm going to be taking you through today. You may have noticed the name change for the series. This is because the composition you just heard, as well as the one in each tutorial, are in the style of the artist. Mind Design is a very unique and special creative, and I am by no means advocating copying his style. See my last tutorial on Taku for how to find your own sound as an artist. A quote from Oscar Wilde perfectly sums up my thoughts on this topic. Be yourself, everyone else is already taken. My hope is that as there is little to no information on his style, sound or workflow, this may help shed a little bit of light on the inner workings of a Mind Design record. First thing to note is that he uses Ableton Live combined with a scattering of vintage synthesizers and drum machines. Take a look at his Against the Clock video for Fact TV for more information on that. It's listed and linked in the description below. In my opinion, his style draws from soul, jazz, funk and disco. His knowledge and skill on the keys really separate his music from his peers in the beat scene. He doesn't necessarily have to rely heavily on arranging and sampling because he can compose and record original chords and melodies, which of course is going to be the main focus of this tutorial. I'll mention a few of his influences are coming from various genres. Now, I feel like his drums definitely are taking inspiration from 80s and 90s disco records, drawing from the drum machines of that era. His chords and melodies feel soulful with hints of jazz progressions combined with a funk arrangement across the whole record. If you're a fan of Mind Design but are not too knowledgeable with your music theory, do not panic. I've got some tools and tactics to present to you in this one to help with just this. There is of course no substitute for true musical theory training, especially if you want to create more musical sounding music. I recommend you all get the Jazz Piano book by Mark Levine, that's Levine, which is a book Mind Design also uses. How do I know this? You can spot it on his Against the Clock video. It is listed and linked in the description for you guys. Enough on that. I've got a couple of different tools I'd like to speak about before we get into this composition. The first aspect I'd like to focus on are melodies. I think a lot of producers have trouble coming up with melodies, and that's partly due to them overcomplicating the process. A melody is defined as a series of notes that are perceived by the listener as a single entity or object. When somebody listens to a melody, they don't just hear it as a random combination of notes, they hear it as something else. They can point out where it starts and ends, they can remove it from the song and remember it. I think people really care about what they can take away from a piece of music. Now, I've broken down a melody into 5 core elements, and they are contour, range, intervals, scale, and structure. I just want to spend the next 5 minutes covering each one of these in a little bit of detail. Any melody will follow a contour, a line that ascends, descends, arches or dips. In saying that, however, I'm not applying that there is a particular formula for a melody. You don't have to have a contour that rises, then falls, and then rises again, etc. to be considered a melody. It is worth bearing in mind that different contours elicit a different emotional reaction from a listener. For example, a melody that ascends may sound more uplifting than one that descends, obviously depending on the sound being used. I'm going to give you a little helpful trick for contours in just a moment. Onto range. The range is the distance between the highest and lowest note of the melody. Some melodies will occupy a very large range, say 2 or 3 octaves and above, while others may have a much smaller range, perhaps half an octave. Depending on what style of music you produce, range may be of great importance, as a wide range will make a melody more difficult to hum, whistle, and remember, and a narrow range will have less variation in pitch and won't sound as interesting. Now of course I'm speaking very generally, as each melody will in turn be unique. On to intervals. Any melody will use more than one note, so there is always going to be at least one melodic interval. The word interval refers to the distance between two notes. The basic intervals are unison, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth and seventh, and octave. Does the melody jump to certain notes, or does it move up them incrementally? It would be useful to learn the different intervals and the music quality they contain. Scales. I think scales are the most talked about topic within the creation of melodies. Essentially, scales are an ordered series of pitches that, with the first key as a reference point, defines the scale's intervals for steps. All melodies are formed from scales, the most popular being modal, which contains variable patterns of major and minor scales starting at different points. Major and minor, these make up the majority of Western music, and I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with them by now. Chromatic. Now the chromatic scale contains 12 pitches, each a semitone above or below another. On a modern piano, all of the semitones have the same size, 100 cents, meaning the notes of an equal tempered chromatic scale are equally spaced. Pentatonic scale. Pentatonic scales contain 5 notes per octave. In contrast to the more typical major and minor scales, they're often used in blues and rock music. Now obviously there are loads more scales worth experimenting with. These, however, are the 4 most basic ones and give you a solid foundation from which you can build upon. I just want to move on to common types of melodies in electronic music. There are tons of different melody structures in music, but I think the 3 main options, or at least the 3 most used structures, are arpeggios, a melody where the notes of a chord are played one after another, chord-based, so melodies that are played with each chord, and motive-based, melodies that repeat and vary in idea. Now that I've covered what a melody is and the key components in one, I'd like to give you some actionable advice for creating them. The first thing to do would be to select a scale to work with them. This may be already dictated if you're working with a sample or a piece of music that you have created. Starting with a scale will limit the amount of notes you can use straight away. This is a good thing, however, as you won't waste time plotting each note by ear or hitting random keys on your keyboard. A useful tool that you can use in Ableton to do this is located under the MIDI effects tab. It's called Scale, but you also have Chord and Arpeggiator that you can play with. Scale is exactly what you'd imagine. You can select a scale, so you place this device before your instrument plugin and then simply play away. Whenever you hit a key that is not in the scale selected, it will change the key to the nearest correct one. Now imagine it like a quantization but for playing the keyboard. This is great for obvious reasons, especially for producers who do not have a strong musical theory knowledge. The tip I mentioned earlier about contours is, now I know this might sound a little bit strange at first, but it can yield some interesting results, so just bear with me. So the first thing you want to do is to find a picture of a city skyline. I've got an image of the Toronto skyline here. Then, in your DAW, try and replicate this skyline, so placing notes like so, following the contour of the skyline. Now, in this instance, we'll ignore the CN Tower, as it's going to mess up the melody. I mean, sure, this might sound like a wacky melody, but it can inspire something pretty cool, or maybe just give you 2 or 3 notes that you can then build from. Once you've got a basic melody going, the next step will be to choose a sound. Many producers will choose a sound before creating a melody. The issue with this is that not every sound works well with every melody. You could have a melody that's perfect for a bass sound, but sounds awful as a lead, and because of this, you might end up trashing the melody. Up until this point in my creation of a melody, I would be listening to it with just a simple grand piano sound. Once you found a sound that works, and you've got your melody going, you've then just got to change your notes around until you see fit. Something I'll do for chords is just jam for hours on my keyboard, recording everything that I do, but try not to force anything. Now I think that's important, remembering that you're having fun and not being fixed in this almost regimented mindset of having to always create a full track. The best ideas come when you aren't trying to think of them. Apply this idea to your workflow. If you're unsure or stuck with chords, I have another free plugin for you. I spoke about this in my knowledge tutorial, but for those that haven't seen it, it's named Schwarzenegger 2 and was created by jazz and soul musician Hendrik Schwartz. Apologies if I'm absolutely butchering his name there. The Schwarzenegger 2 also comes with a companion device called the Little Brother, which applies chord changes from the Schwarzenegger 2 onto other tracks. So for example, you can change the chords of all your MIDI tracks by having a Schwarzenegger 2 on one track and instances of the Little Brother on all the other tracks. Change the chord set in Schwarzenegger 2 and all the little brother instances will follow the change. This is great and saves a ton of time. I personally own a complete control keyboard and play all my MIDI in via this, but if I didn't own that, the Schwarzenegger 2 would be a must have for me. Now that I've covered creating melodies, let's get into this composition. The drums in this record sound like this soloed. I'll just take you through each element separately. So first we've got the kick. And then the snare. And then the percussion. Now the drums on Mind Design's records can be very different. I heard a big disco influence on some of his newer records and a more future beat sound on his older tracks. Using sounds from 80s drum machines paired with a simple disco beat was kind of my thought process in creating these. All of these samples are from my Mind Design sample pack, which is listed and linked in the description below. There should also be a card popping up on the screen right now, which will take you to where you can download it. Now on each element, I've got my standard EQ configuration, as well as this VBR rack from Slate Digital, adding in some bush compression over all of the sounds. Now when using a few sounds together, say 2 or 3, I find a touch of bush compression always helps glue everything together. I don't want to spend too long on the drums though, as the melodic content is really what's important. So let's start with the Rhodes. They sound like this, soloed. Now, I followed all the tips I've previously covered in this tutorial in the creation of this melody. I didn't play it in how you see it here. It was more created in pieces which I then fitted together to create something that actually sounded musical. Producing music isn't always as glamorous as everyone thinks. Now the sound of these Rhodes comes from the Applied Acoustics Lounge Lizard plugin. I've tried and tested many different Rhodes libraries and plugins, and this is the one I've settled on. I'd recommend it to anyone. So the bass sounds like this, soloed. The bass melody is just the bottom note riff down here. I just took this from the main MIDI loop and translated it into the bass line. The plugin chain for the bass is FabFilter's Pro C Compressor, just controlling any rogue note dynamics. Camel Audio's Camel Crusher plugin. This just seems to tidy up the bass. It's also become a staple plugin in my bass processing chain. I've then got the Max Bass plugin from Waves. I like to call this the Little Speaker Bass plugin, as it allows speakers with small cones to be able to reproduce the low end. Or put another way, it allows people to hear the bass on, say, laptop, TV and iPhone speakers. To fully explain the plugin, it would need its own video, but I definitely recommend you look into it, and I'm sure you've all been seeing me using this over and over again. So the compressor here at the end is just sidechaining the bass line to my kick drum. In fact, everything in this track is being sidechained to the kick drum. Or I should say, the kick drum is being sidechained to everything in the track. Mind Design seems to use sidechaining on most of his records. However, on some, it is more emphasised than on others. So the next thing is the lead. The lead sounds like this by itself. Extremely simple 2-note lead. The MIDI again comes from the same loop I took you through in the Rhodes section. Whereas the bass was a copy of the notes at the bottom, the lead is a copy from the notes at the top of the melody. So this section here. When layering instruments together, it is of course important to carve out frequency pockets to place each sound into, but it's equally as important for different instruments to be playing at different MIDI progressions. I see new producers quite often layering up instruments with exactly the same MIDI clip, just copying it straight over. This just sounds like a mess, as potentially 3 or more different instruments are all going to be playing the same notes at exactly the same time. That's just something I wanted to mention, as personally, I think it sounds much better to split the melody up, say, over 3 different instruments. I did some research into MindDesign's sound, and as I said at the start of the tutorial, he uses a ton of different analog synths, but there is a plugin that I would recommend, and it's this, Tell You No Alex. Don't let the name or the interface put you off. It's a completely rewritten emulation of the popular Juno 60 synthesizer, and if you know your vintage synths, you'll know that the sound of the Juno 60 is very sought after by many electronic musicians. MindDesign does actually use this plugin too, which you can see in his Against the Clock episode for Fact TV. If you are curious though, grab the demo and flick through the presets. I'm sure you'll hear something that you like. The last sound on here is this filtered organ that sounds like this. The sound is coming from Silent 1 and originally sounded like this. I decided to filter it out with this EQ and obviously turn it into the sound you just heard at the start. The melody is the same as the lead, and this is just being used as a little extra, something to sit in the background and add a little interest into the track. I do this quite a lot, adding in these almost unnoticeable sounds that you may only hear on your second or perhaps third listen. So quite a lot of people have been asking me what reverb and delay I'm using on my return channels. So my go-to reverb at the minute is this Verb Suite from Slate. Now I have been using Ableton's reverb up until maybe a few months ago, so I don't feel it necessary that you need anything else, but make sure you always change the quality to high on the Ableton reverb device. My delay of choice is the repeater. This plugin comes from D16 in collaboration with Slate Digital. It is a powerhouse of a delay unit, as it features 23 uniquely authentic model delay units ranging from classic oil cans and plates to the most famous vintage digital designs. Although, in saying that, the initialized device works great for me. Onto my mastering chain, which I have made a slight difference to. So I have my own mastering template that I've developed over years of trial and error. Now, this isn't my exact mastering chain plugin for plugin, it's just a slightly different variation that I've been playing around with. One interesting thing that I've actually done on the master chain here is apply this pitch shifting plugin. Now I've pitch shifted the whole track up 4 semitones. So I'll just before and after this for you. This is what the track sounds like without being pitched up. And then with it. Now, before I get my head bitten off for pitching up the whole track, this is something MindDesign actually did on his Fact TV episode, which I thought was kind of interesting and was just something that I wanted to have a play with. So that was the finished result. The next plugin is the BX Control, and I do talk about this a lot, but I know there are new viewers on each video, so I do feel it necessary to mention it. This is a super useful plugin for having on your master output. It allows you to do multiple things, such as check the left-right channels, mid-side, mono, phase invert, and plenty more. I'm using it to make everything under 250Hz mono, and boost the stereo wideness of the whole track by 25%. I then got this new plugin in the chain from Slate Digital called Virtual Tape Machine. Now, the reason I've gone a bit Slate mad in this episode is because I've just received my iLok dongle, and I've been playing around with all of their plugins. I love the sound of tape, and I'm always experimenting with different plugins to get it into my mixes, and this is something I feel MindDesign also does. I've then got the 2 PSP old-timer plugins, one compressing the middle and one compressing the sides. These always just seem to work some magic on records, and I definitely recommend you check them out. My limiter of choice is the trusty L2, and of course, as always, I'm leaving 0.2 decibels of room for any intersample peaks that may occur. Okay, that's it for this one, guys. I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember to like and subscribe to make sure you never miss a tutorial. Also, there has been some issues recently with YouTube not notifying subscribers of new content on a channel, so make sure you click that little bell next to the subscribe button to make sure you never miss an episode. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. I'm out. Peace.